Karl, the first Duke of Pomerania, a man of 50 years, sat in his study, staring at the fire crackling in the fireplace. The flames played reflections on his weary face, framed by a luxuriant wig, and illuminated eyes where the former determination had been replaced by exhaustion. Twice married, he had long ago lost all illusions about matrimony. To marry again, he muttered quietly, as if speaking to himself. Have I not had enough trials sent by fate? The court counselors had long insisted on a third marriage. His second wife, Augusta of Thuringia, had died in the year 1706, leaving behind a sole heir, Crown Prince Johann Leopold. The courtiers, led by Count von Helms, feared the dynasty would die out if the Crown Prince and his wife, Wilhelmina Amalia, failed to provide the dynasty with numerous successors. This meant the state demanded a new marriage. Your Majesty, for the sake of Pomerania's future, we must consider a new consort, the counselors repeated, cautious yet insistent. The Duke frowned. The thought of marriage was unbearable. Karl could have argued with the counselors, but he was weary of fighting. Deep down, the Duke understood. Time was running out, and his illnesses were a constant reminder of his age. He had no choice. A bride was quickly found. Elizabeth Helene, daughter of Elector Philip of Saxony, had grown up in quiet Mersburg, a town where life flowed slowly. The strict Lutheran faith left no room for frivolous joys. The girl possessed a rare beauty, tall, with delicate features and a bright gaze, for which she was nicknamed the Merseburg Aphrodite. Yet, behind this beauty lurked a shadow of loneliness. Her father had died when she was a child, and her mother's care could not give her a sense of security. Elizabeth Helene grew up at the court of her elder brother and was raised in a severe Lutheran spirit. She was 24 years old and still unmarried. For a princess of her standing, this was almost a stigma. Marriage proposals seemed to bypass her. And so, one day, a courier from Stettin appeared in Merseburg. His Majesty Karl of Pomerania offers your daughter his hand and heart, the nobleman announced at her brother's court. The bride's family consented without hesitation. How could one refuse such a match? Elizabeth Helene said nothing. Her consent was merely a formality. No one asked what she wanted. Yet, the girl's heart beat fast when she heard about the upcoming wedding. She tried to imagine her husband, who was nearly 3 decades her senior. Will I be able to love him, or at least respect him? She asked herself. But Karl was not looking for love. He needed a wife capable of bearing children. The bride's beauty mattered little to him. Stories of her piety seemed a pleasant addition to the union. Stettin awaited the new duchess. Townspeople crowded the streets to catch a glimpse of the princess from the northern land. But when the carriage entered the city gates, expectation quickly turned into bewilderment. A slender girl with fine features and fair skin peered out of the coach. She waved, but her movements were clumsy. Her face remained frozen, like a mask. The crowd whispered, "Is this she, our duchess?" they said. How cold, neither a smile nor a greeting. That same evening, during her first public encounter with her husband, Elizabeth Helene unexpectedly fell to her knees before the Duke. The hall gasped. Even her own ladies-in-waiting could not suppress their mockery. "She doesn't even know how to behave at court," one of them remarked maliciously. In truth, no one had prepared Elizabeth for the role of duchess. She was unfamiliar with court etiquette and capital manners. lacked the art of witty conversation, and did not know how to carry herself as the Duchess was expected to. Her sincere devotion seemed ridiculous in the eyes of the court ladies. "Rise, sovereign lady," Karl said reservedly, helping her up. "This is not Merseburg." These words, spoken almost in a whisper, hurt the young Duchess deeply. Karl's attitude towards his wife was more friendly than affectionate. He did not seek to offend her, but there was no love in his gaze. Elisabeth Helene understood everything without words. She was merely a pawn in a dynastic game, a stranger in this brilliant but cold world. Crown Prince Johann Leopold and his wife Wilhelmina Amalia, however, met the new Duchess with open hostility and made no secret of their contempt. To them, she was a rival, not an ally. "You must show her your superiority from the start," Wilhelmina's grandmother had written in one letter. The young crown princess followed the advice. Elisabeth Helene felt like an outsider within the walls of Szczecin Palace. Every day at court became an ordeal for the young Duchess. She feared opening her mouth, lest she say something wrong. She trembled before every glance, in which she read contempt. They tried to stifle her with silence and mockery. The only person she could trust was her lady-in-waiting, von Oberge, who had accompanied her from Merseburg. But von Oberge did not alleviate her sorrows. She amplified them. She brought books, read psalms, and instilled in Elisabeth Helene that her duty was to become not only a wife, but also her husband's spiritual mentor. She convinced the young mistress of the necessity of prayer and repentance. "Your Majesty," she said with stern confidence, "you should be concerned not with court intrigues, but with the salvation of your soul. Your duty is to convert your husband to the true faith. Only then will the Lord be merciful to you." These words brought no relief. On the contrary, they generated fear and doubt. She was disliked at court, and she disliked the court. Courtiers laughed at her manners, mocked her accent, and openly whispered about her barrenness. Even women shunned her, finding her eccentric. She avoided celebrations, disliked dancing, and her chambers maintained a monastery-like atmosphere. Yet, hope remained. Pregnancy could change her position. Meanwhile, rumors that the Duke was frail in health and incapable of fathering an heir had already begun to spread across Europe. Elisabeth Helene did not conceive in the first year of marriage, and everyone, even the most benevolent, began to look at her with cold pity. Brilliance reigned within the walls of Szczecin Palace. Candles reflected in mirrors. The aromas of wine and spices hung over the banquet tables, and the music of lutes and violins filled the halls. But life flowed differently in Elisabeth Helene's chambers. No music played there. No laughter was heard. It was quiet, almost silent, and this silence alarmed those who dared to enter. Every evening, her lady-in-waiting, von Oberge, read lines from the Bible. "The heart is deceitful above all things, and desperately wicked." Her voice was stern and unforgiving, and the words of the Psalms were like hammer blows to the young Duchess's soul. Left without support, Elisabeth Helene was increasingly drawn to mysticism. She prayed for long periods, abstained from many pleasures, and even food. She could often be seen kneeling at the foot of her bed, her face pale, whispering words of repentance. At first, Karl tolerated her eccentricities patiently. "Let her pray. It is better than plotting intrigues," he told his counselors. But soon, he noticed his young wife becoming more and more detached. She avoided conversation, replied in monosyllables, as if her thoughts were far away. Sometimes she would suddenly laugh, or conversely freeze, staring into the void. Meanwhile, the crown prince and his wife more openly displayed their contempt. Sometimes Wilhelmina Amalia allowed herself venomous remarks right in front of guests. "Ah, Her Majesty is probably tired of the world again," she would say. "How difficult it is to be such a saint." Everyone laughed, and Elizabeth Helene would blush and leave. The Szczecin ladies whispered, "The Duchess has not conceived," meaning she is not fulfilling her duty. Rumors of Karl's inability to continue the dynasty only intensified. Even in Thuringia, it was said that Pomerania would not see heirs from this marriage. Elizabeth Helene withdrew further each day. Music, laughter, dancing, all seemed sinful to her. She closed the shutters of her chambers and lit candles, turning the room into something resembling a cell. She prayed for several hours, repeated psalms with her lady-in-waiting, and refused to participate in merriment. Sometimes, looking in the mirror, she whispered, "Lord, save me from temptation. Save me from this world." In those days, Karl still tried to maintain the semblance of a marriage. He treated his wife with respect, sometimes even with care, but there was no passion in him. Their conversations increasingly came down to reproachful admonitions. "Your Majesty," Elizabeth Helene said, bowing her head. Her voice was quiet. "You must understand. Your soul is in danger. Only true faith will grant you salvation. How can you remain in the Reformed faith when the Lord expects more from you?" Karl sighed heavily, and rising from his chair replied, "Enough, Elizabeth. We rule a state, not a monastery." By the year 1712, her eccentricities became obvious. She avoided courtiers, spoke increasingly of sins and eternal damnation. Sometimes she was seized by such agitation that she would scream at her husband, "You will perish, Karl, perish, if you do not embrace the true faith." The Duke, worn out by his own illnesses and state affairs, distanced himself from her. Her fanatical zeal irritated him. He himself was not a lover of idle amusements, but Elizabeth Helene went too far in her piety. In the year 1712, he issued a decree banning gambling and drunkenness. But he did this for the sake of order, not for the salvation of the soul. The Duchess, however, saw the struggle against sin in every step he took. Gradually, Elizabeth Helene became the subject of jokes. Rumors of her eccentricity spread even beyond Szczecin. In a letter dated the 27th of May, 1712, Augusta of Thuringia wrote to her granddaughter, Wilhelmina Amalia, "Your Duchess is no longer in the Duke's favor." I heard the Duke admitted that none of his wives brought him so much sorrow. And it was true. Karl patiently endured her sermons, but spent more and more time away from her chambers. He blamed the lady-in-waiting, von Aubergy, who was confident in her right to counsel the Duchess. Eventually, he made up his mind and sent the lady-in-waiting back to Merseburg. The Duke hoped that Elizabeth Helene would be freed from her influence and find peace. But, deprived of her only companion, albeit a gloomy one, Elizabeth Helene fell into deep melancholy. A void formed in her soul that neither prayers nor books could fill. She began to fall silent more often, sitting motionless by the window for hours, and then suddenly bursting into tears or hysterical laughter. Servants recounted that sometimes she sang psalms with her eyes closed until exhaustion, and sometimes she sat in the dark, unresponsive to questions. "She is raving," the courtiers whispered. "She is losing her mind." But no one dared to speak of it aloud. The Duke pretended that nothing was happening and saw his wife less and less often. And Elizabeth Helene slowly transformed from a young duchess into a prisoner of her own visions and fears. The winter of 1713 in Szczecin was harsh. The palace seemed to be frozen in an icy embrace. Snow crunched under the guards' boots. The wind howled through the stone corridors. And in the duchess's chambers, another cold deepened. The cold of madness. Elizabeth Helene plunged further into her visions. Sometimes she could sit for hours on her knees before a crucifix, praying as if she wanted to beg forgiveness for the entire world. And sometimes she would suddenly start screaming, accusing herself and her husband of eternal sin. "We are doomed," she exclaimed, wringing her hands. "I must save his soul, or the Lord will turn away from me too." The servants watched her fits in horror. The courtiers whispered louder and louder, "The Duchess is mad." But officially, silence was maintained at court. One night, in another fit, Elizabeth Helene broke out of her chambers, slipping past the guard. She was in a long white nightgown. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes burning with madness. She ran through the palace corridors like a shadow, throwing out her arms and muttering something about a curse. "Karl, I must save you," she screamed. Her voice echoed through the halls. Running, she crashed into a glass door. The glass shattered with a crash. Sharp shards cut her skin. Blood dripped onto the floor, but the Duchess did not notice the pain. In desperation, she reached her husband's chambers. Karl was dozing in an armchair, exhausted by state affairs. Suddenly, he opened his eyes and saw before him a blood-stained figure in white. The face was pale, the eyes wild, the hair tangled. The old legends came alive at that very moment. According to the legend, before the death of every duke, the White Lady appears, the ghost of the House of Griffins, Gryphon. "Lord, have mercy," Karl screamed, recoiling. Servants burst into the room and seized Elizabeth Helene. She screamed, struggled, and her hands were covered in blood. The Duke trembled, repeating, "It is she, the White Lady." The servants tried to calm him, explaining that it was merely the Duchess in a fit of madness. But for Karl, the vision became a sign of fate. He was convinced it was a prophecy, and his days were numbered. The decision was made the next morning. The Duke said only one thing: "She must leave Szczecin." His voice was firm, but his eyes betrayed fear. Karl no longer saw Elizabeth as his wife. He had gained nothing from this marriage but wedding celebrations. To him, she had become a sign of death, a shadow, a harbinger of the end. On the 26th of January, 1714, a carriage with tightly closed shutters crossed the snowy roads, carrying the young, but already broken, Duchess away from Szczecin. Elizabeth Helene sat inside, clutching a small prayer book to her chest. Her eyes stared somewhere into the distance, beyond the winter landscape. Sometimes her lips whispered prayers. Sometimes she was silent, absorbed in her own visions. She was returning to Merseburg, to her mother. Elizabeth Helene never saw her husband again. In Szczecin, people sighed with relief. With her departure, the awkwardness vanished. The need to explain to guests why the Duchess did not appear at balls, why she did not host receptions, why her laughter and weeping were heard at night. disappeared. Karl, remaining in Szczecin, was also secretly glad of the decision. For him, Elisabeth Helene had died that night. She appeared before him in a white gown with bloodied hands. But his heart was uneasy. He increasingly recalled the night when the bloody figure in white appeared in his chambers. He could not shake the thought that it had been a prophecy, and the White Lady had warned him of his imminent demise, and the prophecy came true. On the 11th of February, 1714, just a few weeks after Elisabeth Helene's departure, Karl died at the age of 56. His death shocked the court, but surprised no one. Those who witnessed the White Lady that night whispered, "The sign has come true." The Duke could not escape his fate. In Merseburg, Elisabeth Helene's life became a long seclusion. Her mother received her with compassion, but could offer no help. The illness of the soul yielded neither to treatment, nor comfort, nor prayers. Sometimes Elisabeth Helene would wake up in the middle of the night and begin to wander through the house, as if searching for something unknown. Sometimes she sat by the window for hours, staring at the lake. In moments of lucidity, she was quiet and gentle, but these moments became increasingly rare. More often, she descended into delirium, singing, laughing, or crying without reason. Years passed. Europe changed. Pomerania grew stronger. Her stepson, Johann Leopold I, nicknamed the Soldier Duke, already sat on the throne. In Szczecin, the Mad Duchess, exiled to the provinces, was rarely recalled. For history, she seemed to cease to exist. Elisabeth Helene lived in Merseburg for another 23 years. She did not recover, and time brought no relief. She seemed frozen in her madness, like a bird forever trapped in a cage. On the 29th of July, 1738, her heart stopped. She was 53 years old. Elisabeth Helene was buried not in Szczecin, nor in Küssen, where other duchesses found their rest, but in the cathedral church in Merseburg. Thus, she remained the only Pomeranian duchess whose grave is not connected to the Griffins, Greifen. She left no heirs, did not influence politics, and did not enter the chronicles of great events. But her image, descended from the legend of the White Lady, remained in memory. The duchess who became a living harbinger of death, a prisoner of faith and her own fears.